Chapter 10, Procurement. We're going to talk through in this section about the rules that apply anytime we are contracting or we are purchasing goods or services. So when you're hiring a contractor or you're buying materials or a professional service, all of the recipients, and we'll talk about a few exceptions on that, both ADFA and also all of the sub-recipients are going to have to follow the requirements under 2 CFR Part 200. And this is where now the combined federal circulars are in place. And you're also having to be in compliance with the state of Arkansas laws on this. And really the goal of procurement is to try to make sure that we achieve maximum and open free competition so that we, for the dollars we have available, are getting the best value for the use of those dollars. So we're trying to make sure we get the lowest price for our specific materials, our requirement that we have in place. And so these rules are going to apply to local governments, sub-recipients that are contracting or making purchases. It does not apply to a for-profit or nonprofit owner or developer. So if we have a CHOTO project, if we have a for-profit or nonprofit who's applying for funding to build a specific project, then these rules do not apply. So if I'm a for-profit developer that applies for home funds and tax credits to do some multifamily development, the federal procurement requirements do not apply to that project. Now keep in mind that as part of ADFA's oversight of using the home funds, they are held to make sure that all of the costs are reasonable. And so in the absence of procurement, ADFA will be doing some evaluation of those costs to determine whether these appear to be reasonable and appropriate for those projects. As I mentioned, CHOTOs also do not fall under the 2 CFR Part 200 requirements. And so again, unless they're running a program as a subrecipient, they're going to be excluded from these procurement requirements. So when we're thinking about procurement, keep in mind that you're required to have, the home program requires that you have written rehabilitation requirements, but you also have a number of other written policies and procedures, and procurement is one of those. So that would outline how you are going to implement the small purchase requirements we're going to be talking about, or our sealed bid process. So kind of laying out the who, what, and when requirements as part of that. It's also really critical, since we're going to have a competitive process here, that you be very clear on identifying the specific goods and services that you want, and also the standards that you want in place. So if you think about it, if I am a contractor and I'm going to bid on some scope of work that you've provided, I'm trying to be the lowest bidder. So I'm going to try to find the cheapest way, the cheapest materials and the cheapest way to install those materials perhaps, to try to be that lowest bidder. And that works to the disadvantage of a good, a good builder who's saying, I don't want to use some of those lesser materials. So you need to very clearly specify within your scope of work, within your specs on the type of materials, but also the installation methodologies, to make sure that you've kind of created a level playing field where all of the vendors will have to be using a minimum standard in place, and so that your better quality vendors will have a chance, essentially, at being competitive. We're trying to make sure that we get the best quality for the funding that we have available. Your written agreement will be then in place with those vendors once that's been procured. You need to have records in place to be able to show that you followed the procurement requirements. So that scope of work, we're going to be talking about bid announcements and tabulating the bids that came in, evidence that you had a public bid opening. All of that needs to be captured within your record-keeping system to be able to document that, yes, I did follow these requirements, and this is the basis on how I selected a particular vendor. And that's kind of the saving grace on how you make sure that you not only are getting a good value for your money, but also when you have a vendor who was not selected, that you have a clear and transparent process to show how those decisions were made. So there are 5 levels of procurement that are laid out within the federal procurement requirements that are found at 2 CFR Part 200. And we're going to walk through each one of those and the specific requirements that go with those. And you'll see that generally, the larger the dollar figure, the more complex the undertaking is, the more stringent those procurement requirements are going to be. So our small purchase procurement, which is less than $10,000, is probably the most streamlined process on this. This is for small purchases, but it does not include professional services or construction contractors. This does not require a formal bidding process. We're simply going to get written quotes from an adequate number of qualified sources. Generally, when we're looking to determine that we have a competitive process, generally our goal is to have 3 quotes. And our award is going to be made to the lowest responsible bidder. So if my small purchase is for, I don't know, 12 cases of paper for my printer, and I may have specified a particular weight for that paper. If I have someone that comes in that has the lowest bid, but it is not the kind of paper that I asked for, that it is not responsive on that, and we're going to reject that. So we need to be pretty specific on what it is that that written quote is for on this, and then we'd have a good paper trail to show that if we did not take the lowest of these quotes, that it's because it didn't line up with what we were requesting. So this is our simplest level of procurement requirement. For any goods or services that are from $10,000 to $50,000, we're going to have to go through a more formal process and have 3 competitive bids. So as part of that, we're going to use a standard template. ADFA is suggesting you have a standard template that you use in place. So all of your vendors are filling out the same form, providing the same level of experience. That's for goods and services between $10,000 and $50,000 in estimated value for this. For anything that, for goods and services that goes over the $50,000 level, and also for all home-funded construction contracts, we're going to go with a much more formal process. So we're going to have what we call a competitive sealed bid process. So there are some specifications about how this is going to be operated. We have a standard publication period. If you look in Chapter 10 on 10-3, these are all spelled out for you. But there's going to be a notice or an invitation for bids that will go out not less than 5 calendar days before when we expect to open those bids, and not more than 30 days. This is going to be advertised in a newspaper of general circulation or posted with electronic media. But in all instances, you're going to have to show as part of your record keeping that you did this appropriate outreach to seek bidders. We're trying to create that competitive process by getting as many bidders knowing about this and being able to do that. That notice will also clearly define what it is that we're seeking, whether it's goods and services, whether it's a construction project that has a specific scope of work, including quality of materials, installation methodologies, all of that. That notice is going to lay out the time and the date and the place for that bid opening. So in a competitive sealed bid process, our bids are being provided and held, so they're going to be sealed bids that are held not opened until our public bid opening is going to happen. So that would mean that not only members of the public, but also the vendors who are bidding could show up if our bid opening is going to be at 10 o'clock on Monday morning. They all can attend that public bid opening. One by one, each of those sealed envelopes will be open, and we will record the name of each bidder and the amount for that bid. We will then be evaluating those bids to determine, are they responsive? So if you asked for specific costs to be broken out and particular materials to be used, was their bid responsive to your specifications? But also, are they a responsible bidder? Meaning, have they, if you've had a vendor that you've had difficulty with in the past and you have some kind of a standard evaluation criteria to use, you might choose to deem that vendor as not being responsible because of a proven track record on not being able to provide a quality job, or maybe not finishing jobs within a certain period of time. You might have a standard that that same vendor couldn't have more than a certain number of current projects underway at any given time because of a concern about their capacity to be able to undertake that. So at the public bid opening, we record our bids. We're at that point going to have what appears to be our lowest bidder, but that's when our evaluation process begins to determine, will we accept all of those bids, or will we discard some of those bids based on not being responsive to what the bid specifications were, or based on some kind of a performance issue and are deeming them not to be responsible. At the point that we have made our selection of the lowest responsible and responsive bidder, we would then execute a fixed price contract or unit price contract in place with that bidder. We have also a category of competitive negotiation. This is for professional services that are over $25,000. So generally, we're using a competitive negotiation where it has to do with professional services, but we also need to evaluate their skills. So it might be that we need to hire an architect, and so we want to look at their past work, their skills, the type of projects they've undertaken, but we're also going to be evaluating the cost for that. So we have two ways to be able to do this. We have the request for proposal, which is an RFP, or a request for qualifications. And I would suggest that you turn to Chapter 10 to read through in further detail on this. But generally, with the request for proposal, we are going to ask as part of that, present your qualifications to be able to undertake this job and provide us a bid for this specific scope of work. Maybe this is going to be an appraiser, and so they're going to provide you with their qualifications as an appraiser, and they're going to give you a set price per property that they would charge. And so we would be able to evaluate both qualifications and price under an RFP methodology. If we're hiring, maybe let's say we're doing we are going to do a new construction multifamily rental property. We might want an architect who specifically had worked in affordable housing and kind of understood our goals for this, not only sort of structurally, but also aesthetically. So we might do what we call an RFQ, which is a request for qualifications. So it's not looking at a price, it's simply creating a pool of vendors that we have determined to be qualified. So we might have architects that are going to submit their qualifications. The person that's only done shopping malls and hospitals is probably not going to be selected as being qualified for this project. At that point, then we could negotiate with our pool of bidders that under our RFQ to select the final architect who's going to be able to complete our project. So again, we're going to have publication requirements. We're going to need a clear definition of what it is, the task or the skills that are going to be needed on this. And we'd also have to have a methodology of how we're going to evaluate those proposals. And usually that's some kind of a rating and ranking system, and we have some ranges on that that we will use to make that determination. So with an RFP, we'll be awarding the proposal that is our lowest responsive bidder. For an RFQ, we would be defining that pool of qualified vendors and then negotiating to select who would actually receive the contract. Our easiest to most ideal option under our 5 federal procurement methodologies is our non-competitive negotiation. And I'm sorry to say this is the one that you probably will not be able to use. So a non-competitive negotiation is at the point that we find that there is not a competitive environment, and so we can't use our other methods of procurement. So a lot of times people will say, well, you know, I posted my invitation to bid, and I may have sent out or contacted a number of folks and said, hey, we're seeking bids. I only got 1 bid back in, and 1 bid would generally not be considered to be a competitive process. And folks then want to say, well, I should be able to use non-competitive negotiation because there just isn't a competitive market on that. Generally, ADFA is going to look at this, and as would HUD, and say, well, you know, we question about how you actually marketed this bid. Generally, you're going to be required to go back out, try to market more broadly, and see if you can get enough bids in to have this be a competitive procurement. So you can only use the non-competitive negotiation process with written permission from ADFA. They're going to be looking at your marketing and outreach on this to make sure before they give you permission to be able to use this methodology. So probably not something you're going to be able to use. So just as a reminder on this, we have our small purchases at under $10,000. We have our competitive purchase, which is $10,000 to $50,000. And then we have our sealed bid process, which is going to be for all construction and also goods and services that are exceeding the $50,000 mark on that. We also have competitive negotiation that we would be using for professional services. And then our 5th category is our non-competitive negotiation, which we mentioned can only be used after conferring with ADFA and receiving written permission to be able to use that methodology. I would encourage you to take a look at Chapter 10, which goes over the details on each one of these categories. Other things that have to be considered as part of the procurement process. You have to keep an eye out for conflict of interest. So you're required to have a written code of standards to prevent conflict of interest in place. And so you would be seeking statements from bidders about whether there's any known conflict. So conflict of interest would include something where that bidder has some sort of inside track or advantage on this. That might be that, you know, if that bidder had a relationship, let's say that their husband or wife was actually part of the city's process that was going to be costing this out and processing the bids, or they had sort of inside information to know before other bidders or have additional information on that, that would constitute a conflict of interest. Also, we need to mention the excluded parties. So the federal government has a process, so when they have vendors that have misbehaved in some way or another, that they can be debarred or essentially blocked from being eligible to receive any additional federal contracts. And so before any of your contracts were awarded, you would be required to use the SAM.gov system that's listed here to check and see if that contractor or subcontractor is included on that debarred list. And so essentially you're searching on SAM.gov by the names of the contractor and subs. You'll be able to print out the results of that search, and that would be contained in your files to show that you had followed the process to ensure that you were not contracting with an excluded party. If you did that search and the vendor's name came up as an excluded party, they would be ineligible to receive that award, and you would go back to your procurement process and determine whether there was another vendor from that procurement process that actually was the next eligible bidder, and go in that way. Also keep in mind that the state is requiring you to use minority and women-owned businesses whenever possible. And so as part of that process in your marketing, you'd be trying to do appropriate outreach to include and notify those entities about the ability to apply or compete for these funds. So as part of that, in the standard forms, there is a minority and women business enterprise plan that is part of your procurement plans. And again, these are all found at ADFA, arkansas.gov, and that would constitute part of your file documentation for your procurement.